يعني احنا مش عارفين لا وين نروح ولا وين نجي. يعني اللي بيصير معانا حرام، والله حرام اللي بيصير معانا. ايش احنا عملنا عشان يصير في الشعب هيك؟ مش للناس ترمي حالها عيش.
قصفوا علينا في الليل، قصفوا العمارات اللي حوالينا في الصفطاوي، احنا طبعا معيادة السويدي في الصفطاوي، قصفوا علينا العمارات اللي حوالينا، واجت الطيارة نزلت علينا وقالت لنا اطلعوا معكم 10 دقائق، وشي زي ما انت شايف العالم كلها طلعت يعني من غير ما تاخذ اي حاجة، اخذت كل حاجة اللي تقدر عليه تقدر تشيلها. حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل، ايش بدنا نساوي يا خالد؟
مليان الناس بتنسى.
جانوا بده مصاري يا خالتي، والله ما معانا مصاري لا نطلع ولا ننزل. الطحين استنزفنا، كل يوم كيلو طحين، كيلو طحين تشتغل عن 5 اكياس طحين، استنزفنا الطحين. يعني انا مش ملاقي الحين اركب، بس لو اصل نص غزه يعني اقف في اي مكان امن، بس مش قادر ما فيش لا معانا مصاري ولا معانا ركوب ولا معانا اي حاجه، وانا مش تايهه عن اولادي، مش عارف وين اولادي، تايهه عنهم.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's special live stream. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching the stream on YouTube, on Rumble, or on Ganjin Word. And special thanks to our dear friend Red Access for moderating the live chat. Today, I'm not going to be able to check the live chat much because I have prepared to you a very long and thorough criticism of Pat David's podcast and him hosting Benjamin Netanyahu and giving him a pushy time on his podcast, and why I believe that Benjamin Netanyahu has succeeded in his mission of spreading the Hasbara talking points on Pat David's podcast. And I believe that in such cases, it is not Patrick or all the other podcasters, independent podcasters between brackets in the US who choose to interview Benjamin Netanyahu. It is him who picks and chooses on whose show and on whose podcast he is going to go in order to find new audiences to reach, especially in what is called, or the so-called and self-proclaimed independent podcasts in the United States, after the mainstream media has lost all credibility in the eyes of the Americans, of the Europeans, and all the people around the world. There is a consistent attempt to corrupt these podcasters and these big podcast venues by giving war criminals like Benjamin Netanyahu a platform in order to try to downplay the atrocities he and his government and the previous governments have committed against the Palestinians and other people in the region. Now, if you have watched this interview, that's great, because then I'm going to decimate point by point and expose the fraud and the hypocrisy of Pat David by not only hosting him, but also by giving him an easy time on his show. So I'm going to go in a great length and depth in this podcast and decimate and expose every argument and almost, let's say, every argument and every section of this 40 minutes interview. So I'm going to play unmute, of course, the interview that Patrick himself published on his X account. And on the other side, I'm going to give you my criticism and my commentaries about this interview, which was 41 minutes long. If I finish this with 45 minutes or 46 minutes after the start of the stream, there is also another topic I would like to cover, but let's start with this interview. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to talk about something deeply troubling that happened recently. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, a man accused of overseeing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in the eyes of many, especially in the eyes of human rights organizations, an ongoing genocide in Gaza. He was invited onto the PBD podcast, or Benjamin Netanyahu, he picked PBD podcast to go and spread his Hasbara talking points. Why PBD? Because it is a platform with millions of viewers. And unfortunately, PBD handed a very friendly stage to launder his image. This isn't just another celebrity podcast, my friends. This isn't just one more interview in a busy media cycle. What we watched was the leader of a government currently facing investigation at the International Court of Justice for genocide, sitting down for a chat that came across more like a PR tour than journalism. Netanyahu used Patrick Bet-David's platform to do what he explicitly said he came to do, to fight what he calls the 8th front, the battle for global opinion, or the propaganda war. And instead of challenging him, instead of pushing back on falsehoods, instead of holding him accountable the way a journalist should do, PBD sat back and essentially played the role of facilitator. He gave Netanyahu space to normalize Israel's talking points, to downplay the destruction of Gaza, to smear international institutions, and, astonishingly, to announce recognition of the Armenian genocide in a way that was framed as magnanimous, while his own military was and is reducing Gaza to rubble and displacing millions. Let me be absolutely clear with you. Journalism has responsibilities. Platforms with reach, especially those boasting of independence from mainstream media, carry obligations to their audiences. If you bring on someone accused of genocide, someone who is using your space, as a battlefield of propaganda, you do not treat that as a polite fireside chat. You interrogate them, you fact check them, you bring receipts with you. You make sure your viewers understand the weight of what's being denied, excused, or distorted. Instead, what we got was Netanyahu being allowed to cast Israel as a perpetual victim, to recycle the same Hasbara tropes about the tiny democracy fighting off barbarians, and to frame every criticism as lies, pushed by bots and anti-Semites. And what was PBD's response? Nods all the time, softballs, gratitude, no confrontation with the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, no serious probing of the ICJ case, no accountability for the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians killed, starved, and displaced. Now, why does this matter? Because propaganda is not a side game, my friends. It is a central component of war. Netanyahu himself spelled it out. He said the military front and the information front are interlinked. This is what Netanyahu said. And when a US-based podcast platform with a massive audience gives him an uncritical space, that's not neutrality. That's collaboration in the narrative of war. It is important to emphasize that this isn't about silencing voices we disagree with. Netanyahu has every opportunity to defend his government's actions on the world stage, but the problem here is the imbalance, right? He was not challenged, he was not confronted with evidence, he was not fact-checked. The Palestinian perspective, for example, was absent. The human rights reports were absent. The journalists in Gaza risking their lives and getting killed daily to document war crimes were absent. Instead, we got Netanyahu's monologue with PBD playing the role of curious but differential student. And this has consequences, right? When propaganda is laundered through popular media without scrutiny, it reshapes public opinion. It dulls outrage. It normalizes atrocities. It allows war criminals to appear as statesmen, like they try to do also with Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, right? And it turns audiences, often unsuspecting audiences, into passive participants in whitewashing of crimes. So today, my friends, I want to do what PBD did not. I want to go through Netanyahu's performance line by line, claim by claim, and unpack the Hasbara. I want to show you what was left unsaid, what was distorted, and what flat out false. And what I want to explain, why PBD failed in his journalistic duty, why simply asking questions is not enough when you are speaking to someone accused of mass atrocities like Benjamin Netanyahu. We will talk about how Netanyahu framed October 7 and how the framing is used to justify collective punishment in Gaza. We will dig into his dismissal of the International Criminal Court and why his narrative about a corrupt prosecutor is a smoke and mirrors designed to obscure Israel's actual legal vulnerabilities. We will analyze together his portrayal of the US-Israeli relationship, the myth of Israeli self-reliance versus the reality of dependency on American aid. And crucially, we will examine the moment he recognized genocide, not out of genuine solidarity, but as a cynical PR move. Even as Israel's fingerprints are all over the ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And through all this, we will come back to one central point. PBD failed. He failed his audience, he failed journalism, and he failed history by allowing Netanyahu to use his platform for Hasbara without pushback. So, my friends, buckle up. This is not going to be comfortable, but if we are serious about truth, if we are serious about accountability, if we are serious about journalism as a check on power, that then we cannot let performances like this pass unchallenged. I hope you guys are ready what is going to come next. When Benjamin Netanyahu sat down with Patrick Bet-David, one of the very first things he said, remember, this was very revealing. PBD asked him why he was doing this podcast tour, and Netanyahu didn't dance around it. He said in plain language that he was doing it to, quote, puncture the lies and vilifications leveled at Israel, quote ended. He called it, quote unquote, eighth front, the battle for truth, or propaganda, right? That one sentence tells you everything you need to know about Hasbara, Israel's state-sponsored propaganda strategy. So let's break down what Hasbara means. Hasbara, a Hebrew word that literally means, quote, explanation, quote ended, is Israel's long-running project of controlling the narrative. It is not just PR. It is not just spin. It is a systematic effort backed by government ministries, lobby organizations, think tanks, and diaspora networks to shape how Israel is perceived abroad, especially in the West, which means it is the weaponization of storytelling. And Netanyahu is a master of Hasbara, right? His entire political career has been built on this dual track: military force on the ground, propaganda warfare in the international arena. That's why he didn't hesitate to call this podcast appearance part of an eighth front. He sees information as a battlefield no less important than Gaza or Lebanon or Syria. Now, what are the core pillars of Hasbara? They're remarkably consistent, right? And you can see each one play out in this interview. So let's decimate or expose the first pillar of this Hasbara. Israel is the eternal victim. This is the first pillar. Netanyahu paints Israel as a tiny state, constantly under siege by savage enemies. He references the Holocaust, October 7, the Iranian Axis as proof that Israel is perpetually on the brink of annihilation. This framing positions every Israeli action, no matter how brutal, as defensive, right? He said, quote, "We don't wait to be annihilated," quote ended. Or, quote, "We act to prevent it," quote ended. It is a classic Hasbara move. Erase context, erase power imbalance, and cast the regional superpower, Israel, with nuclear weapons as a fragile victim. The second pillar of his Hasbara, Palestinians as faceless terrorists. Notice how Netanyahu talks about Gaza. He doesn't acknowledge civilians. He doesn't name hospitals, schools, or families. Gaza, in his telling, is nothing but a base for Israel's destruction. Hamas is not just an organization, but the entirety of Gaza's identity. And anyone questioning this framing is accused of being naive about savages or manipulated by propaganda. This is textbook Hasbara. Collapse the distinction between armed groups and entire populations so that mass punishment can be justified as self-defense. Third pillar of the Hasbara, delegitimizing critics. When confronted with the International Criminal Court, Netanyahu doesn't address the substance, the allegations of indiscriminate bombing, starvation, or mass killing. Instead, he goes straight for character assassination. In this case, the ICC is corrupt, the prosecutor is rapist, the institution is politicized, etc., etc., etc. So he uses one anecdote to smear the entire judicial body without addressing why 124 states are prepared to arrest him if he lands on their soil. This is classic Hasbara. Deflect, delegitimize, distract. The fourth pillar of Netanyahu's Hasbara, tying Israel's wars to the West's wars. Another key Hasbara tactic is to insist that Israel isn't just fighting for itself, but for civilization. Netanyahu told PBD, quote, "When we fight Iran, we are fighting your war too. Our victory will be your victory," quote ended. So he cast Israel as the badger fighting lions, as the lone outpost of Judeo-Christian civilization against barbarism. This rhetorical sleight of hand binds American audiences emotionally to Israel, making support for its military actions seems like a moral obligation. Pillar 5 of the Hasbara, showcasing Israel as innovative and indispensable. Netanyahu boasted that Israel produces the technology in your cell phones, your medicine, your cherry tomatoes. He claimed that Israel is the sixth eye in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, providing intel that keeps Americans safe. This is, of course, another Hasbara theme. Israel isn't a burden, it is a gift, according to him. Ignore, of course, the billions in US aid, ignore the destabilization, ignore the occupation, focus instead on deep irrigation and microchips. Now, why does this matter in the context of PBD's podcast? Because Hasbara only works if it is given oxygen. It only works if powerful platforms allow Netanyahu to repeat these talking points unchallenged. And that's exactly what happened here. Instead of interrogating these claims, PBD nodded along. Instead of bringing up Gaza's humanitarian collapse, he let Netanyahu reframe the conversation around Israel's supposed economic miracle. Instead of pressing him on Palestinian civilian deaths, he let him expand on anecdotes about watching National Geographic. Think about that for a second. While children in Gaza are dying of starvation, Netanyahu is comparing Israel to a honey badger. And PBD doesn't stop him to say, but Prime Minister, your government is deliberately blocking aid tracks. The UN has warned of famine. Doctors are performing amputations without anesthesia. Instead, PBD gave him silence. That's how Hasbara succeeds. Not because it is persuasive, but because it is uncontested. Now, let's zoom a little bit out from this. Hasbara isn't just about Netanyahu or Israel's foreign ministry. It's about the machinery that ensures the Israeli narrative dominates Western discourse. It's about well-funded lobby groups that pressure journalists, blacklist academics, and flood social media with coordinated talking points. It's about shaping algorithms, sponsoring junkets, and inserting Israeli officials into influencer circuits. And that brings us back to PBD. His podcast is precisely the kind of platform Hasbara needs in 2025. It's not mainstream CNN or BBC, where Netanyahu expects hostility or tough questions. I mean, even on CNN and BBC, he will not receive that anyways. But since these outlets are at least pretending to be objective, or at least their audiences are giving them lots of backlash and headache because of their insane coverage of the Gaza war, maybe on these mainstream outlets, he would have received a little bit tougher questions. But PBD is considered independent influencer space, a realm with younger, politically diverse audiences, many of whom are skeptical of legacy media, which means by appearing on PBD, Netanyahu taps into fresh demographics, rebrands himself as approachable, and bypasses traditional gatekeepers. And PBD, whether through naivety, difference, or calculation, played right into it. He didn't see himself as part of a propaganda war, but Netanyahu did, of course. And in that asymmetry, Israel wins the information battle. Now, here is the key point I want to drive home. When Netanyahu calls this the Eighth Front, he is admitting that propaganda is not peripheral. It is central. The bombs flattening Gaza and the narratives justifying them are two sides of the same coin. If you win the narrative war in America, you guarantee the flow of weapons, aid, and diplomatic cover. If you lose the narrative war, you risk embargoes, prosecution, and delegitimization. That's why Hasbara exists. And this is why PBD's failure is so grave, because when you give someone like Netanyahu a microphone without scrutiny, you're not just hearing him out, you're actively participating in the machinery of Hasbara. You're helping to sanitize war crimes for a global audience. So let's call this what it is. This was not an interview. It was a propaganda victory, a battlefield won by Netanyahu without firing a shot, because his opponent didn't even realize they were even in a fight. Or maybe PBD didn't even see it that way. When Patrick Pat David asked Netanyahu about why the war has dragged on, Netanyahu framed everything around October 7. In his telling, October 7 was the most savage attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, right? He invoked images of decapitations, of children burned alive, of women raped, all presented as self-evident justification for whatever Israel has done since. Now, let's pause here. October 7 is considered a horrific attack by many, many Israelis and Jews around the world. So let's not dispute how they perceive that, right? No one disputes that many families feel terrorized, whether rightly or unrightly, justly, unjustly, but they feel terrorized. We also know, of course, we have addressed this several times on this YouTube channel, that many of the Israelis who were killed during that day were killed by the Israeli forces themselves, because they enacted their doctrine, the Hannibal doctrine, which allows the Israeli army to kill Israelis who were kidnapped and on their way to Gaza. But all these things, let's put it aside. There is a critical point here. The horror of October 7, right, doesn't grant Israel a blank check to commit atrocities against an entire civilian population. Collective punishment is not self-defense. Bombing apartment towers, starving children, flattering hospitals, that is not fighting Hamas. That is war against the people. And yet, Netanyahu's framing eases that distinction. In his narrative, Hamas is Gaza. He describes the Strip as nothing but a base for Israel's destruction. He says the goal is to finish off Hamas, because we can't have those monsters at spitting distance from Tel Aviv, in his words. But what he doesn't say, and what PBD never presses him on, is that Israel's military campaign has killed tens of thousands of civilians, displaced nearly 2 million people, and reduced Gaza to rubble. Let me give you some context Netanyahu carefully avoids. The UN has warned repeatedly that famine is imminent in Gaza, with children already dying from malnutrition and dehydration. Aid convoys have been systematically blocked or bombed. Hospitals have been raided and bombed. Their staff executed or detained. Journalists, more than in any other conflict in modern history, have been killed by Israeli fire. And the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, found it plausible that Israel is committing genocide. That's not an activist rhetoric. That's an interim ruling of the ICJ. But none of that made it into this interview, right? Instead, Netanyahu was allowed to repeat Hasbara talking points. Hamas is in its last breath. Israel is approaching the final leg of victory. Gazans are now joining Israel to fight Hamas and are grateful for Israel's presence. These claims are really astonishing in their detachment from reality. Independent reports from Gaza shows civilians trapped on the rubble, entire families wiped out, children pulled from mass graves, and yet PBD simply nodded, never asked for evidence, never challenged the idea that Gazans under bombardment, blockade, and mass displacement are supposedly tanking the very army destroying their homes. This is why journalism matters, because propaganda thrives when there is no counterpoint. Imagine if PBD had asked, Prime Minister, how do you square your claims with the UN's report of famine, for example? Or what do you say to the ICJ ruling? Or even the most basic question, right? How do you distinguish between Hamas and the 2 million civilians living under siege in Gaza? But those questions never came. And in their absence, Netanyahu's narrative slid into place. October 7 as original sin, Israel as righteous avenger, Gaza as an expendable battlefield. Let's also examine how Netanyahu manipulated the time horizon. He repeatedly framed October 7 as an existential moment, a battle that has been going on for 3,500 years, he told PBD. This is another Hasbara tactic. Stretch the conflict across millennia, collapse modern political violence into biblical struggles, and present Israel not as nuclear-armed occupier, but as a perpetual victim of timeless hatred. Once you accept that framing, everything becomes justified, because if it is existential, then no measure is too extreme, right? And here is the problem. PBD let Netanyahu. PBD let him. Instead of grounding the conversation in present-day facts, blockades, settlements, occupation, international law, he allowed Netanyahu to mythologize the conflict, to turn Gaza's suffering into an abstract struggle of civilization versus barbarism. This is how propaganda works, by hijacking the frame of reference before facts can be examined. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because numbers are where Hasbara always falls apart. According to Gaza's health authorities, over 62,000 to 65,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 7. Of course, the number is way higher than that. 82% of them, according to Israeli leaked military report, 82% of them are civilians. So of 62,000 civilians dead, 82% of them are civilians. This is according to leaked Israeli military report. This is not a Palestinian one. Of course, tens of thousands more are missing, presumed under rubble. UNICEF has reported that every single child in Gaza is in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. The WHO has documented attacks on nearly every hospital in the Strip. None of these figures are disputed by credible international observers. And yet, in this interview, Gaza's civilians were invisible. They didn't exist in Netanyahu's telling, and PBD didn't bring them into the conversation. Instead, Netanyahu compared himself to Churchill. He said people once called Churchill a warmonger when he warned about the Nazis, and that the same is true of him. This is the audacity of Hasbara, appropriating the legacy of fighting fascism to justify mass killing of Palestinians. And once again, there was no pushback from PBD. Here is another striking moment. PBD asked about the ICC, noting that if Netanyahu travels to over 120 countries, he risks arrest warrants for war crimes. Finally, one sharp question from PBD. But Netanyahu said, and he dismissed the question, and he said this is irrelevant, and claimed it's just a political theater. And PBD let him off the hook. No follow-up, no citation of the specific charges, no mention of the Geneva Conventions, just silence. And yet, this is exactly what journalism must do: hold leaders accountable to facts. When Netanyahu claims that Gaza is a base for destruction, the journalist's job is to ask, but what about the civilians? When he says Gazans are tanking Israeli soldiers, the journalist's job to ask, where is the evidence? When he compares himself to Churchill, the journalist's job is to point out that Churchill never bombed refugee camps into dust. Instead, PBD played the role of the nodding student. Curious, perhaps, but never confrontational. And in that dynamic, Netanyahu got what he wanted: the opportunity to reshape October 7 from a terrorist attack into a permanent justification for the annihilation of Gaza. Here is the bottom line. October 7 was horrific, but it doesn't erase Israel's obligations under international law. It doesn't justify indiscriminate bombing. It doesn't justify the starvation of population. It doesn't justify ethnic cleansing. Netanyahu knows this. That's why he needs platforms like PBD's to rewrite the narrative, because on the ground, the facts are damning. And that's why PBD's failure matters, because when journalists do not challenge power, they become part of power's machinery. And when it comes to Gaza, silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. I want to continue with more of this podcast interview and decimate even more. One of the most revealing exchanges in the entire PBD interview came when Pat David raised the subject of International Criminal Court. He noted that under international law, Netanyahu could face arrest in more than 120 countries, and that many observers are calling Israel's actions genocide. Now, this is where a serious interviewer would have pressed hard, because this is not a fringe accusation. The International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, separate from the ICC, by the way, has already ruled that it is plausible Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. That's the ICJ, not a protest slogan somewhere in Berlin or in Paris. And the ICC is actively investigating war crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territories, which could result in arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials. These are not abstractions. These are live legal processes with profound consequences. So how did Netanyahu respond? By attacking the court himself. He called the ICC corrupt, politicized, and claimed that the prosecutor Karim Khan fabricated charges to cover up sexual misconduct allegations against himself. He didn't address the actual substance of the charges. He didn't refute evidence of indiscriminate bombing, starvation, or the mass killing of civilians. Instead, he went after personalities, spinning a lurid story of misconduct to smear the entire institution. This is classic Hasbara deflection, by the way. When you can't answer the charges, delegitimize the messenger, reduce international law to gossip, transform war crimes into political theater. And notice here, PBD didn't follow up on this question. He didn't ask the obvious question. But Prime Minister, what about the evidence? What about the mass graves, the destroyed hospitals, the starvation warnings? Instead, he let Netanyahu move the conversation into a morality play where Israel is the victim of woke Europeans and corrupt prosecutors. Let's step back and clarify the facts. The ICC has jurisdiction over war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Palestine because Palestine is recognized as a state party to the Rome Statute. That jurisdiction covers both Hamas and Israeli actions. The case is not about politics, it is about evidence, and the evidence collected by all the investigators and the organizations, undergrounds, UN agencies, journalists is overwhelming. Deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, use of starvation as a weapon of war, indiscriminate bombing of densely populated areas. These are textbook war crimes. Now, Netanyahu claims that because Israel has a proper judicial system, the ICC has no role. But this is disingenuous. Israel's domestic system has a long record of shielding military officials from accountability. Investigations, when they happen at all, rarely lead to prosecutions, and convictions are virtually non-existent. That's why international jurisdiction exists, to step in when domestic systems fail. And let's not forget, the United States, though not a party to the ICC, has sanctioned ICC officials in the past year when they threatened to investigate the Israeli officials and also in the past American soldiers. So Netanyahu leans on that precedent, portraying the ICC as an illegitimate, meddling body. But this is, of course, projection, because what he really fears is that the evidence is too strong to ignore. Consider the gravity of the accusation. Genocide is not just another crime. It is the crime of crimes, defined as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. When the ICJ says it is plausible that Israel committing genocide in Gaza, that means the threshold has been met for urgent investigation and preventive measures. It means the world cannot dismiss the allegations as rhetoric. And yet, on PBD's show, this was reduced to gossip about one prosecutor's private life. This is not just misleading, it is dangerous because it shifts attention away from the victims, the people of Gaza, and refocuses it on elite drama in The Hague. It erases the substance of the charges and replaces it with theater. And when journalists don't intervene, the theater becomes the story. Let me underscore this. International law is one of the only tools available to oppressed peoples when military force and geopolitical power are stacked against them. Palestinians cannot compete with Israel's arsenal. They cannot compete with Israel's US backing. Their only resource is law, documentation, and international solidarity. When that too is delegitimized, when courts are mocked, when journalists allow leaders to hand-wave charges away, Palestinians are left with no path to justice. And here is where PBD's failure looms large. He had Netanyahu on the defensive. He had brought up the ICC, the arrest warrants, the genocide accusations. This was the moment to hold power accountable, to say, Prime Minister, millions of people believe you are overseeing genocide. What do you say to them? Instead, he let Netanyahu turn it into a story about corrupt prosecutors. No evidence demanded, no challenge issued, no reminder that the ICJ had already weighed in, just a shrug and on to the next question. This is how propaganda works. It doesn't deny outright, it distracts, it doesn't debate evidence, it smears. It smears the institutions gathering it. And unless journalists push back, audiences are left with the impression that it is all politics and everybody is corrupt. That cynicism is not neutral. It directly benefits those in power because it makes accountability seem impossible. Let's also note the hypocrisy. Israel often celebrates the Nuremberg trials as a foundation of post-Holocaust justice. It invokes international law when convenient, demanding recognition of the Holocaust and prosecution of Nazi crimes. And yet, when the same legal principles are applied to Israel's actions, suddenly the courts are illegitimate. This double standard is not accidental, by the way. It is structural. It is Hasbara in action. And PBD perhaps unwittingly played along. By not pressing, by not citing facts, by not grounding the conversation in the reality of Gaza's suffering, he allowed Netanyahu to escape accountability. He allowed the focus to shift from war crimes to gossip about prosecutors. He let Hasbara win. So here is the truth that was missing from the interview. Israel is facing credible accusations of genocide. The ICJ has ruled those accusations plausible. The ICC has jurisdiction to prosecute war crimes committed in Gaza and the West Bank. Netanyahu, as prime minister, is directly implicated, and no amount of smear campaigns against prosecutors will erase that reality. And the journalist's job is to make sure audiences understand that. PBD did not. And in failing to do so, he helped Netanyahu deflect attention from the most serious allegations any leader can face, the deliberate destruction of a people. He's still speaking. I'm just checking now the stream to see if the interview is already over. There is still like 6 minutes or so. Another major theme that ran through the PBD interview was Netanyahu's portrayal of Israel's relationship with the United States. Again and again, he presented Israel not as dependent, not as a client state, but as a self-reliant ally. The scrappy honey badger of the Middle East, carrying civilization's torch against the barbarians. At one point, PBD asked him directly about the common criticism that Israel owns America, that whenever Israel wants something, all it takes is a phone call. And Netanyahu, without hesitation, said, quote, "Absolutely not. That's hokum. You don't make President Trump to do anything. He does what he thinks is in America's interest." This is what Netanyahu said. Now, this is where a journalist has a duty to introduce facts, right? Because US-Israel relationship is not based on sentiment. It is based on material flows. Billions in military aid, vetoes at the UN Security Council, and decades of diplomatic cover for Israeli aggression. The numbers are straightforward. For example, the US provides Israel with $3.8 billion annually in military assistance, locked in through a 10-year memorandum of understanding. That's taxpayer money, guaranteed regardless of Israel's behavior. And during the Gaza war, this aid was supplemented with emergency shipments of munitions, including the very bombs that flattened refugee camps in Gaza. Netanyahu downplayed this, presenting Israel as a giver, not a taker. He told PBD that Israel spends an inordinate share of its own GDP on defense, that 80% of US aid is actually spent in America, boosting US arm manufacturers, and that Israel provides invaluable intelligence as the sixth eye of the Five Eyes alliance. In other words, don't think of us as a client. Think of us as your most reliable partner. This is the message that Netanyahu sent. But this is Hasbara 101. Because recasting dependency as reciprocity, the numbers do not lie here. Without US aid, Israel's military campaign would be unsustainable. Without US diplomatic cover, repeated vetoes at the UN Security Council, Israel would face crippling sanctions and embargoes. Without US technological transfers from the F-35 jets to precision munitions, Israel could not maintain its qualitative military age. And without US pressure on allies, Israel would be isolated internationally. So let's be clear. Let us be clear. Israel is not an independent actor simply fighting for civilization. It is a heavily subsidized extension of US power in the Middle East. And Netanyahu's narrative obscures this reality. He presents Israel as the lone warrior while downplaying the lifeline that makes the warrior possible. Now, what was PBD's role in this exchange? Instead of interrogating these figures, instead of asking the tough questions about US taxpayers funding alleged war crimes, he allowed Netanyahu to set the terms. When Netanyahu said, quote, "Our victory will be your victory," quote, ended, PBD didn't challenge it. When Netanyahu claimed Israel is fighting America's war against Iran, PBD didn't ask whether ordinary Americans actually want to bankroll endless wars in the Middle East. When Netanyahu said aid is mostly spent in the US economy, PBD didn't point out that this still amounts to billions of dollars funneled to weapons companies, money that could have funded schools, healthcare, or infrastructure at home. This is the heart of journalistic failure: the inability to connect lofty rhetoric to material consequences. Because Netanyahu's framing makes it sound like Israel is doing America a favor, but the reality is that Americans are paying with money, with global credibility, even with security risks, to underwrite Israel's occupation and wars. Think about how Netanyahu framed Iran. He said, quote, "When we fight Iran, we are not just fighting our war, we are fighting your war," quote ended. He cast Israel as the shield protecting America from terror, missiles, even nuclear weapons. But did PBD push back by asking, isn't it Israel's policies, the occupation, the siege, the bombing, that fuel anti-American sentiments across the region? No. Did he mention that Israel's assassination campaigns and regional strikes routinely dragged the US into wider conflict? No. Instead, he let Netanyahu present Israel as indispensable. And here is the bitter irony. Far from saving American lives, US support for Israel has repeatedly put Americans in danger. The 1983 bombing, for example, of US Marines in Beirut, which Netanyahu referenced, was not a random act of hatred. It was retaliation for US and Israeli interventions in Lebanon. Iran's hostility toward America is not abstract. It is rooted in decades of US backing for Israeli occupation and regional wars. In other words, the alliance Netanyahu frames as a gift has often been a liability. But you wouldn't know that from this interview. Instead, you would think Israel is the brave soldier holding the line while America reaps the benefits. And that is the magic of Hasbara when left unchallenged. It flips the power dynamic upside down. It erases dependency and replaces it with gratitude. Let's also address Netanyahu's honey badger analogy. He compared Israel to a small but ferocious animal standing up to lions, in this case, Iran and its proxies. It is a colorful image. The PBD laughed along, but it obscures the actual reality. Israel is not a vulnerable badger. It is a nuclear-armed state with the most advanced military in the region, backed unconditionally by the word superpower. To pretend otherwise is absurd, and a journalist's role would be to puncture that absurdity. Instead, PBD treated it as a charming metaphor. I'll just make myself bigger here. And let's not forget the economic angle. Netanyahu claimed that despite the cost of war, over $120 billion, according to PBD's number, Israel's economy remains strong thanks to its tech sector and foreign investment. Again, a moment ripe for follow-up, because war has already strained Israel's economy, ballooned its debt to GDP ratio, and triggered capital flight. More importantly, the sustainability of Israel's economy rests on continued US aid and trade privileges. But instead of probing this, PBD allowed Netanyahu to present Israel as an economic miracle, untouched by the costs of endless wars. Here is what should have been asked. Prime Minister, if Israel is so self-sufficient, why does it require $3.8 billion annually from American taxpayers? Why did you come to Washington demanding more aid? Why should Americans pay for your wars while their own infrastructure crumbles? Those questions were never asked. Instead, Netanyahu left the interview having reinforced his preferred narrative: Israel as a self-reliant, Israel as America's protector, Israel as a giver rather than taker, and for an American audience unfamiliar with the details of military aid and diplomatic cover, the narrative sticks because no one challenged it, right? This is where PBD's difference matters most. It's not just about missing facts, it's about allowing a frame to be set that shapes how millions of people understand geopolitics. By nodding along, by accepting Netanyahu's spin at face value, PBD became a vessel of Hasbara. And the consequences, of course, are real, because when Americans believe Israel is fighting their war, they are less likely to oppose aid. When they believe Israel is self-reliant, they are less likely to demand accountability. And when they believe Israel is the honey badger standing alone, they are more likely to overlook the devastation in Gaza. That's the power of propaganda, my friends, when journalism fails. It doesn't just distort the truth, it shapes public opinion in ways that sustain war. Now, this part is very important, especially to me, as an ethnic Armenian. One of the most surreal moments in the PBD interview came toward the end, when Patrick Pet David asked Netanyahu why Israel has not recognized the Armenian genocide. For years, Israel's official line was to avoid calling it genocide, right? Instead, using vague terms like tragedy, largely to protect its ties with Turkey and Azerbaijan. But on this podcast, Netanyahu abruptly shifted. When pressed, he said, "Yeah, I just did." In other words, live on air, he casually recognized the Armenian genocide. PBD thanked him. He treated it as a historical gesture, and indeed, in one sense, it was. This was the first time a sitting Israeli prime minister publicly uttered the word genocide in relation to Armenians. But let's be clear. This was not a moral breakthrough. This was not solidarity with Armenians. This was simply and purely propaganda. It was Netanyahu using a genocide acknowledgement as a political instrument, a tool of convenience, to rehabilitate his image while his own government stands accused of committing genocide in Gaza. And the hypocrisy runs even deeper, because while Netanyahu recognized the Armenian genocide with one hand, with the other hand, Israel has been actively complicit in Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Let me explain. Using reporting, for example, from Haaretz, starting in 2010, Israel developed a strategic relationship with Azerbaijan built on two pillars: oil imports and arms sales. Azerbaijan supplies a significant portion of Israel's oil. In return, Israel sold Baku billions of dollars worth of advanced weaponry, including drones, missiles, and surveillance technology. According to Haaretz, over a 7-year period, 92 Azerbaijani cargo planes landed at Israel's Ovda air base, the only Israeli airfield authorized to export explosives. That means a steady pipeline of arms flowing from Israel to Azerbaijan, right as Azerbaijan waged wars against Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is not a speculation, right? Azerbaijan has proudly displayed Israeli weapons in its military parades. It has revealed Israeli drone factories on Azeri soil. And Israeli suicide drones have been filmed striking Armenian targets, including inside Armenia itself. In other words, Israeli technology has been central to Azerbaijan's military campaigns. And what were those campaigns? Ethnic cleansing. In September 2023, Azerbaijan launched a final assault on Nagorno-Karabakh, forcing more than 120,000 Armenians, the vast majority of the enclave's population, to flee. Villages emptied overnight. Families who had lived there for centuries were displaced en masse. This was not just a military victory, it was the erasure of an ancient community. And Israel's fingerprints are all over it. Even more damning, Israel hasn't just armed Azerbaijan, it has helped it distort history. During a 2020 court case, Israel's own foreign ministry admitted that one reason it avoided recognizing the Armenian genocide was its relationship with Azerbaijan. At the time, Israel has supported Azerbaijan's propaganda campaign to label a 1992 battle in Khojali as a genocide against Azeris, despite the fact that international consensus is clear. No genocide took place there. In other words, Israel has been willing to weaponize the concept of genocide when it suits its Azeri ally, while denying the Armenian genocide when it threatened that alliance. Think about the cynicism here. For decades, Israel downplayed Armenian genocide to protect its strategic relationship with Azerbaijan. Then, on PBD's podcast, Netanyahu suddenly flips, casually recognizing the genocide. as though it cost him nothing, even while Israeli arms are fueling the ethnic cleansing of Armenians until this moment. And this recognition comes at the exact moment when Israel itself is accused of genocide in Gaza. So this is not moral clarity, this is PR. This is Netanyahu using acknowledgement of one genocide as a smokescreen to deflect from another. And PBD, of course, didn't catch it. He didn't press him, he didn't ask. Prime Minister, how do you reconcile this recognition with your government's arms deals with Azerbaijan? How do you recognize the Ottoman genocide while your drones are driving Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh today? Instead, he thanked Netanyahu. He treated it as a magnanimous gesture. I always say this is not journalism, and these journalists are complicit, because what Netanyahu did here was profoundly cynical. He turned the memory of the Armenian genocide into a talking point. He used it to polish his image, to appear statesman-like, to show that he could rise above politics and acknowledge historical truths. But the truth is that Israel has weaponized history for decades. It has denied recognition when it suited its interests. It has helped Azerbaijan rewrite the past to erase Armenian suffering, and it has supplied the weapons used in the present ethnic cleansing of Armenians. The Haaretz article put it bluntly. Israel's fingerprints are on multiple cases of ethnic cleansing, from the Rohingya in Myanmar to Muslims in Bosnia and now Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. When you mix massive arms exports with historical distortions, the result is predictable. It leads to atrocities. And so the image of Netanyahu on PBD's show, casually recognizing the Armenian genocide while his own military is starving Palestinians in Gaza, is not just hypocrisy, it is grotesque. It is the ultimate demonstration of how Hasbara works. Weaponize history, manipulate memory, deploy genocide recognition as justice, not as justice, sorry. I'm tired already from the mental gymnastic that I did while I'm preparing this show for you. So this is how Hasbara works. Weaponize history, manipulate memory, deploy genocide recognition not as justice, but as propaganda. This is why journalism matters, because if PBD had done his homework, he would have known about Israel's role in Azerbaijan. He would have read Haaretz. He would have asked the hard questions. Instead, he handed Netanyahu the stage for a propaganda coup. Genocide recognition as image laundering. And let's be absolutely clear. Recognition of the Armenian genocide is essential. It is long overdue, but not like this. Not as a cynical PR stunt by a leader overseeing atrocities of his own. Not without acknowledging Israel's complicity in fresh ethnic cleansing of Armenians. Not as cover for crimes unfolding in Gaza. The Armenian genocide deserves recognition. The Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh deserve to return to their homes. And Palestinians, of course, deserve freedom. What Netanyahu offered on PBD's podcast was none of these things. What he offered was Hasbara, dressed up as moral clarity, and PBD let him. I want to conclude this stream by saying we have spent this stream unpacking Benjamin Netanyahu's appearance on PBD Podcast, and I believe he has failed miserably in this case. He failed for multiple reasons, because I want to just count a few failures that he did. First, difference instead of accountability. Throughout the interview, PBD treated Netanyahu not as a politician accused of war crimes, but as a celebrity guest. He thanked him repeatedly. He expressed curiosity rather than skepticism, even when he asked difficult questions about the ICC, about war costs, about genocide accusations. He didn't press when Netanyahu deflected. He accepted answers at face value, moving on quickly instead of drilling deeper. That difference transformed the interview from journalism into a PR exercise. Failure number 2, lack of preparation. If you're going to interview someone like Netanyahu, you need receipts. You need to come armed with data, reports, counter-arguments. You need to be ready when he deploys Hasbara tropes, but PBD came unprepared. When Netanyahu claimed Gazans were joining Israel to fight Hamas, PBD didn't cite UN reports showing mass civilian displacement. When Netanyahu smeared the ICC, PBD didn't point out that the ICJ has already ruled genocide plausible. When Netanyahu recognized the Armenian genocide, PBD didn't bring up Israel's arms sales to Azerbaijan. In every case, the absence of preparation allowed propaganda to go unchallenged. Failure number 3. Netanyahu is skilled at collapsing history, turning modern wars into biblical struggles, casting Israel as a perpetual victim. A journalist's job is to restore context, the occupation, the blockade, the settlements, the imbalance of power. PBD didn't do any of this. He let Netanyahu frame October 7 as an existential 3,500-year war without ever mentioning that Gaza has been under siege for nearly 2 decades, or that Palestinians live under a system of apartheid documented by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. By failing to provide context, PBD allowed myth to triumph over fact. Failure number 4. Some might argue, isn't it good to hear Netanyahu's perspective even if we disagree with it? But here is the problem. Platforming without accountability is not journalism, it is propaganda laundering. If you're going to give a head of state accused of genocide an hour on your show, you have an obligation to fact check in real time, to challenge distortions, to make sure your audience isn't left misinformed. PBD didn't do that. He gave Netanyahu a stage, a microphone, and, of course, a smile. That is complicity, my friends, not curiosity. Failure number 5. Centering power and erasing victims. Notice who was absent from the conversation. Palestinians. Not a single Palestinian voice, perspective, or statistics was present. The people enduring bombardment, starvation, and displacement were invisible. Instead, the focus was on Netanyahu's narrative, Netanyahu's justifications, Netanyahu's historical analogies. That erasure is itself a form of complicity, right? Journalism should center the powerless, not amplify the powerful uncritically. And here is the deeper problem. PBD isn't alone. This is what happens when influencers step into the role of journalists without embracing the responsibilities of journalism. Having a big platform doesn't make you a journalist. And doesn't make you an expert, by the way, PBD. You're expert on nothing when it comes to geopolitics. Asking questions doesn't make you a journalist. Journalism requires rigor, fact-checking, accountability. It requires confronting power, not flattering it. Netanyahu knew what he was doing. He chose this platform precisely because it offered reach without scrutiny. He knew PBD would treat him with respect, not interrogation. He knew this would be a friendly stage where he could recognize the Armenian genocide for PR joints, dismiss the ICC without consequence, and reframe Gaza as a fight for civilization. And that's exactly what he got. So let's be blunt. Patrick Bet-David failed. He failed his audience, who deserved truth rather than spin. He failed journalism, which exists to hold power accountable. And he failed, of course, history by allowing a man accused of genocide to rewrite their narrative unchallenged. And this failure matters because propaganda is not harmless. It shapes public opinion. It influences policy. It numbs outrage. When Netanyahu leaves an interview like this looking reasonable, statesman-like, even magnanimous, it makes it easier for US politicians to keep sending him weapons. It makes it harder for ordinary viewers to grasp the scale of the Gaza suffering. It turns mass atrocity into a matter of perspective rather than a matter of law and morality. This is why we have to call this out, not just Netanyahu's propaganda, but the platform that enabled it. Because journalism is supposed to be a check on power. PBD, in this case, was a megaphone for it. So, this is a 1 hour and 5 minute rant about PBD's interview with Benjamin Netanyahu, which went completely unchecked and unchallenged, unfortunately. I had to do this for myself, to go segment by segment and write my notes and prepare this decimation and challenging and exposure of Patrick Bet-David's shameful act, and he considers himself half an Armenian. So I have to, I believe that this is a double responsibility for me, especially that the Armenian genocide was mentioned, and the Armenian genocide is not up for political bazaar, Mr. PBD, and you shouldn't have allowed that. So, my friends, this is going to be the conclusion of today's stream. I hope you liked it. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe to this YouTube channel. And if you like to support this independent work I'm doing, you can become a patron. The link is scrolling on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. And special thanks to every one of you guys for tuning in on YouTube, on Rumble, on Ganjing World, and also a very big thanks to our friend Rain Access for moderating the live chat. And I will see you tomorrow on Thursday at the same time, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you and upon your families. Salam.